A warm welcome to all our viewers. This is Goa Story. Devsurabhee Yaduvanshi in talk with Dale Menezes. And this is the Let's Talk segment. A brief introduction about my interviewee today. Dale Luis Menezes is a PhD student in history at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. His primary interests lie in modern empires, knowledge production, and colonization in South Asia. He also writes about Goan literature in Konkani and Portuguese and politics, including a regular column in Goa's Herald. So, welcome to the segment, Dale. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, to begin our segment today, just to ask you, um, you recently wrote an article about the Inquisition, how history has been misused, and you mentioned the Black Legend. Can you summarize what this propaganda phenomenon is and how it has been misused in the current context?
Sure. So the article was not about the Inquisition per se, to be honest, but about the scholarship around the Inquisition, right? And we have very few books or articles that are readily accessible in Goa, and so what we depend is on one book by A.K. Priolkar. And so my article was a reflection on how this book published in the 1960s, 61 actually, is now a dated work, but it also has its problems. And one of the things that I realized was the very liberal use of this Black Legend myth. Now, to be very brief about it, the Black Legend was a propaganda that started somewhere around 1600, perhaps earlier, in the areas where Spain ruled, especially in the Netherlands. And it was at that point in time, by the 1600s, the Netherlands was fighting against the Spanish monarchy to gain independence, and so on one hand, the Dutch produced this propaganda, but also at the same time, the English were trying to rival Spain, especially in the Americas, for over commercial supremacy. So even they started also producing this propaganda. So while the propaganda has been in existence since at least the 1600s, the name was coined, the Black Legend was coined only in 1912 by a Spanish journalist. And we don't need to go into the reasons why in 1912 this name was coined, but suffice it to say that the propaganda exaggerated the atrocities and the violence of the Spanish monarchy, both in Europe and in the Americas, right? And so in that sense, the propaganda served as a counterpoint, right? So on one hand, you had the Spanish atrocities and barbarities. On the other hand, you had the English, the English as the better rulers, for instance, right? But this is not really true, because at the same time, the English and the Dutch, for instance, were also colonizing, say, in Asia and in the Americas. So in a sense, it became a way to kind of measure oneself as better than the other, although one is no better than the other. And the Inquisition then became kind of emblematic of this of Spanish presence in the Americas or in Europe, because it kind of denied religious liberty, and it played into the Catholic-Protestant conflicts in Europe, and so that's the basic context of the propaganda. Now, in the Goan case, now this was kind of, the Black Legend was kind of a general framework that was used to understand Iberian empires, right? And Portugal was also one of the Iberian empires. In the case in Goa, its most visible legacy, I think, is seen in the writings of Britishers from the 19th century, right? Now, there were many British writers, and not all of them had this kind of stereotypical ideas. And then there's a recent book that looks at British travelers in Goa, by Filipe Lounge Vicente. It's in Portuguese, but it's a good resource to think about all the British writers in Goa. So what many of these writers did was again compared the former Portuguese glory, and they said, oh, look, now this has-been empire is in decline, but look at the British Raj, it's so way better. It's not so barbaric as the, so you can see the politics happening, right? And I think many writers post 1961 or even before that depended on these on these British authors and their interpretative frameworks, and of course Priorkar was one of them. And more specifically, I think as I said earlier, this was a general framework, right? And so what happened was the Portuguese period, roughly covering 450 years, but not across Goa, right? The new conquests were not part of the 450-year rule. Came to be seen as this sort of backward, decadent, and the oppression was highlighted more, like, and you can see the impression of these ideas in this interpretation of Goan history. Well, again, we know that this is not really true because if the Portuguese Empire stuck so long, it was also because of they had local support. There's no doubt about that. And the late Antonio de Souza wrote about it. And the former archivist of Go Archives, PSS Visulikar, he also wrote about it. He had a book called Colaboradores Hindu, or the Hindu Collaborators. Uh, when I say collaborators, I don't mean to cast them as the villains of the story again over here, because if you look at the landscape in, say, early modern Goa, or in the Goa of the past, or anywhere in South Asia, this was pretty common. Like Europeans were helping locals, and locals were helping Europeans against third party. So this was business as usual, right? And so on and so forth. Like you have examples of local Goans giving loans to the Estado. You have the Escola Medica, or the medical school, Asia's first medical college, for instance. So in a simple way, you have good and bad. But I'm not trying to make this story as as good versus bad, or that the bad is cancelled out by the good. What I'm trying to say is that there's a complexity to the past, and we need to consider the totality of Goan history and try to. And I mean, of course, we need new interpretative frameworks, new ideas to kind of make sense of the past. Just if I may indulge myself again, for instance, just to think about how complex things can get. Like just think about what the role of the medical college has been. It of course trained doctors. It was Asia's first, but those doctors then went and worked in Portuguese Africa, for instance, Mozambique, and some of our Mozambique friends and scholars would say that it's not so much the Portuguese who colonized us, but there was a lot of Goans who did that. So these things become really complex, and we really need to figure out a way to how to think about Goa's past. Yeah.
I guess that the burning need, if I may say, is about capturing and portraying history. Not even portraying; it's coming up with texts and research which depict Goa's history as it is, without
Mhm.
taking aside. And that's the sense that I get from what you're saying, is that it has to be completely unbiased and just
Yes.
present.
Right. And
So I'll come
yeah.
to my second question. In your article, you underline an aspect that Priolkar never addressed in his book, that is, why Christians continued with their faith even after the Inquisition. So, can you explain this omission and how this has contributed to the propagation of a skewed perspective?
Right, I think it's results out of ideas of foreign religions, right? And this was an idea that was quite current, leading in the nationalist movement in India, and even after that. And this has been analyzed, especially by scholars such as Chandra Manampalli, who has done some great work on this, and he specifically looks at, say, the Gandhian idea of Swadeshi, where there was an objection to say, especially in the context of Dalits converting to Christianity, there's an objection saying that, Swadeshi would mean that we don't need, say, the foreign religions on one hand, and on the other hand, the conversion was okay within this idea only if it was done for spiritual purposes. And clearly, nobody thought that Dalits would convert for consideration other than material, right? So the idea was that material inducements were part of why this convergence happened. And so, honestly, there are only questions here. I think, to be fair to Priyorkar, I don't think he could have, thought about these issues, because these are issues that are this recent scholarship, recent research has brought to light. But again, so there are only questions over here. So, why did, say, the subaltern caste persons convert? And then there's also the question of why did the upper caste convert, right? Because obviously they didn't need the material inducements, right? And so again, and the third question comes, so you have these various contexts in which these histories happen, and so what does conversion mean in each of these contexts is also another question. I think that needs to be that has to be addressed when one is talking about this history in the past, especially the religious history of the past. So I think there is some. It's a point that is not yet resolved, right? And it needs to be thought about more. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. So let me address the next question to you. You've mentioned in your article that access to documents that are in Portuguese have made matters difficult for those in pursuit of the truth. Vice versa, research carried out in Portuguese, those documents are out of reach for the masses. So what are your suggestions on this front, and how to tackle this stumbling block which we are facing?
So I have some rather practical suggestions. I think also that have come. I'm suggesting those out of my own experience. Is that I think we need to invest. Scholars need to invest time and some effort in learning more languages, and that doesn't just stop with Portuguese, right? Goan history is recorded in Marathi, in Konkani for starts. Persian is important, so is Kannada. And so these are like the new things that we realize that we need to access these sources also in other languages. So that's one as far as sources, and also we need to learn the Modi script, right? Which in which even some parts of the Portuguese documents have two languages. The one is Portuguese and the other one Marathi, written in the Modi script. So we barely scratch the surface of what we have in terms of historical sources. And the most important stumbling block is that we don't have the kind of language skills, so we don't invest in the language skills. I think translations are important as well, and some Portuguese scholars have been doing it, but I guess I guess we need more translations in this regard. Another point I would make is the preservation of the archives, and the climate makes it very difficult, especially in Goa. And you open some documents, and a lot of dust falls down, and you breathe a lot of dust if you work in the archives. And so what I want to suggest is that we need to have digital access to these records as much as possible. We need digitization. A lot of archives in Europe, for instance, the VOC archives in The Hague, the archives in the UK, have now started either digitizing more and giving access to it for free. The archives in Portugal were already doing it. And especially in a post-COVID-19 scenario where you can't travel to archives, and it's really everybody is now realizing that it is important to have access to these archives. But also on a practical level, I think even without COVID, it doesn't make sense to me for say a person in Concon, if there's a researcher in Concon, to travel every day to Panjim, right? And so you can save so much time. I know somebody who has young kids, and I was thinking, should she use the 3 or 4 hours she has in traveling to the archives and libraries, or should she just, could she use that time more productively? So there's an issue of logistics, there's an issue of access, equity, and so on and so forth, which I think is important, is addressed through more digitization. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. And these are very practical suggestions, and it made me realize as well that there's so much time that is wasted, especially in Goa. You don't realize it, that
No.
there's so
Yeah.
much up and down that happens, which can be avoided
Yeah.
if a
Yeah.
lot of digitization takes place.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Brings me to a social question connected to what you've been talking about. Do you become a target of politics of religious sectarianism because of your name and faith? And has this affected your efforts in any way while you talk about such issues?
Mm-hmm.
Because given the current political environment in Goa as well as the whole country, um, the sort of things you're talking about is taken not in a nice way, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of opposition. So, what has your experience been on this front?
Well, I agree the situation has gotten a lot worse, but I don't think personally I have experienced as much as say my friends, and I think it's through their experience that I realize how much it affects our lives. Uh, for instance, I'm quite shocked every time my friends get attacked for speaking on the same topic, and they don't share the same identity or religion or whatever that I share, and so I think I would be lying if I was personally a target or something like that, and hope not in the future. Uh, but I think it's important that all of us take a step back, take a deep breath, and listen to what others are saying. Go back home and think about where that person is coming from and why he or she says the things that they're saying. And it's really important that we understand. Yeah.
Because there's this sense, what you're suggesting of, and it's actually pretty simple. What you're saying is that we need to record history as it is instead of giving, uh, instead of it having a biased perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
somewhere the idea of the Inquisition is so deeply ingrained. Even I have, heard so many horrible stories about the Inquisition.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them might not be true if we actually get to the bottom of the whole matter. So, that anything that talks about a shift from an already established, uh, narrative,
Mm-hmm.
is met with the kind of opposition that is, somewhere expected, but also it's very overwhelming at times. So
Right.
again, why I address this question to you is because it's being used as a political weapon. So
Mm-hmm.
immediately seeing you, your name, and the faith that you hail from, it is kind of taken as an effort that you're trying to whitewash
Mm-hmm.
away the atrocities, because constantly there is a conversation when we talk about, like I have said to people, that okay, the Portuguese were here, they've been here for about 450 years, and there's a lot of good things that they've left behind, and there's a lot of the bad stuff as well. I'm not a historian, but I can say respect for whatever has been the result of the Portuguese rule in Goa. You can't just wish it away and say that this is not part of our history, or every single
Sure.
thing in culture over here has the Portuguese touch in some way or another. So,
So,
I
yeah. I mean, it's. I think it's a question of also what sources we are looking at. How reliable these sources are, and so that's always a constant struggle. I think I always insist on whoever cares to listen is that we really need to be very cautious and careful about what sources are used. And also, I mean, in recent times, and more scholarship has sort of made have given us a more complex picture of the East-West, let's say, connection. And for instance, the argument of the late Oliver Gomish, for instance, who was the head of the Samarian for some years over here. His book on the church architecture, he says, this church architecture that you find in Goa is not European at all. It's Goan, uh, and so, when we talk about cultural cross fertilization or whatever it's called, I think it's important to bear in mind like how we are, where these ideas are coming from, like where we start our own understanding, and and it's also always a constant requirement that we ask ourselves whether we are right, or uh, whether we are thinking in the correct way possible, right? Yeah.
all right. And so, thank you so much, Dale, that you've taken the time to be with us and share perspectives on what you've spoken about in your article, and also the work at large of recording history. So thank you so much, and to our viewers, please do comment in what you think about today's conversation with Dale Luis Menezes. This is Goa Story, and this is a segment called Let's Talk with Devsurabhee Yaduvanshi. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.